Let me first turn to Aaron. Aaron Wolf is a professor of geography in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Science at Oregon State University. And he's also a visiting professor at IHE Delft. He specializes and is very well known for his work on transboundary water conflict and cooperation. So looking into how states interact over the water resources they share. Something that's actually quite important if we look at the more than 300 shared rivers and lakes around the world. And I'd be curious, Aaron, to know from you, will we see, as a consequence of climate change in the future, more conflict between states around the water resources they share? Or do you think we'll see more cooperation because water diplomacy is advanced and countries have acknowledged that there's a need for cooperation? Or do we see maybe both? What's your take on that, Aaron?
Let me just make a couple of kind of general points about conflict and cooperation and climate change. And I want to note that I'm going to be focusing mostly on transboundary waters. And as you noted, the first point is the problem is big. So there's 310 transboundary basins. It's half the land surface of the Earth. 40% of the world's population and 80% of water originates in these basins. And there are another 600 some shared aquifers between two or more countries. And I'll focus on the dynamics there between countries, knowing that you and Peter and others have been involved in both looking at intranational issues and also the relationship between international and international. So that's the first point, is that the problem is big. The second problem is in terms of conflict and cooperation, the major issue is not a lack of water. People try and solve these issues through dealing with scarcity, but when we look carefully, the things that trigger conflict between countries really is the relationship between change in a basin and the institutional capacity to deal with change. And what does that mean? If you build a dam, you can build a dam as long as there's an agreement between the two countries in how to mitigate the impacts of the dam, social impacts, environmental impacts, political impacts. And if there is no capacity to deal with that change, then you have conflict. And that's the biggest kind of trigger internationally, is somebody wants to build something and there's no capacity to deal with the impact. So if we look at the Nile, the Grand Renaissance Dam, we look at dams in Laos and China on the Mekong, Central Asia, upstream countries are building dams that downstream countries object to. And so this comes to our point. This is when development partners get involved in the funding of these projects and noticing that one of the impacts of climate change is greater variability, which oftentimes means people are looking for other storage options, which oftentimes means more dams. So that's one of the impacts. The third, this at the international level gives us a really nice entryway into early warning. Because if we know a project in the absence of capacity is our potential trigger, both of these things can be monitored. Where are people going to build things? And is there an agreement or a river basin organization or dialogue that can help alleviate the political pressures of these projects? And so at the international level, we're really good at looking for early warning and identifying potential hotspots. Intranationally, as I'm sure we'll hear, it's much more complicated and more nuanced. And I hope we'll hear about Ural's efforts. Next point is that these crisis points, while we focus on the conflict and the press and political people get excited about the potential for conflict, these triggers often bring precisely the resources necessary for dialogue. So it brings international attention, it brings resources, it forces people into a room where maybe they'd gone years or decades simply trying to avoid the fact that they share water between them. And so there's a timeline that goes kind of from crisis to opportunity, which again, development partners can be very useful in helping to promote this shift from potential conflict to dialogue and maybe even peace building. And so that's where I think I just want to end up is what can FCDO and other partners do? One, it's to help facilitate those dialogues, but to think about the design of a process where the diplomatic people and the water people are talking to each other, not just to solve a water problem, but to use the water problem as a vehicle for dialogue and maybe even enhance peace building efforts and diplomacy into arenas much broader than water. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I just wanted to lay out these touchstones as we get started.
Thanks a lot, Aaron. That's definitely good news insofar as, yes, we are seeing conflicts at the transboundary level, but we also know that things can be done. You said there is an opportunity to turn crisis into opportunities, but that's really focusing at the transboundary level, at the interstate level. I'd like to turn to Peter. Peter is the co-founder and the President Emeritus of the Pacific Institute in California, and definitely one of the people internationally who knows about water conflicts, who has studied them, has mapped them, has counted them. So Peter, I'd like to know from you, if we move from the transboundary to the more national, subnational, and local level, how do things look like there? Can we be equally optimistic or rather not?
Following up on Aaron's introduction, let me also provide a little bit of context, given Susanne's question. My first point is that there is a long history of conflicts over water resources. As a resource, we, and by we I mean the Pacific Institute, my research institute in California, maintains something called the Water Conflict Chronology. It's an open source database on water conflicts. It goes back more than 4,000 years. With over 1,000 entries through about 2019. We still have to do the 2020, 2021 update. And to expand on some of Aaron's comments, we think about conflict over water in three different ways. Aaron talked about, I think, what the most common conception of this is, which is water is a trigger of conflict. The idea of, I want your water, water scarcity causing disputes between and among different kinds of parties. So water as a trigger of conflict is one piece of this. But we also look at two other categories. The second is where water or water systems are weapons of conflicts that start for other reasons, for all of the reasons we see violence around the world, ideology, economics, borders, ethnic and religious disputes, but where water systems are used as weapons during those conflicts. And examples of that are, for example, recently, the Islamic State, for 3 or 4 years, worked quite aggressively to control the dams on the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers and use those dams either to withhold water or to release water at different times during the Syrian-Iraq conflict. The third category is water or water systems as targets or casualties of conflict, where water systems, again, are attacked during conflicts that may start for other reasons, not water-related reasons, but for other reasons. And again, we've seen recent examples of this in Yemen and Syria, where civilian water systems were very aggressively and intentionally attacked during those conflicts. We saw it in World War II when the RAF bombed the dams in the Ruhr Valley, where the water systems were strategic targets. When we look at all three of these categories of conflicts, water-related conflicts, the bad news is we see a very significant and dramatic increase in them during the recent decades. The numbers of these conflicts have grown in recent years. And that is primarily, although not entirely, as Susanne has just asked, subnational conflicts. They're conflicts between ethnic groups, between religious factions within a country, not necessarily in the transboundary basins that Aaron has discussed. Although I would argue we do see an increase in some of the transnational disputes over shared water resources. Again, in some of those basins that Aaron described, those 300 internationally shared basins, where we don't have agreements, like the Tigris and the Euphrates, like the Mekong, like the Indus, like the Nile. Another point is that the number, as I said, the number of these conflicts seem to be on the rise. It's a mix of subnational and multinational conflicts. I would argue it's partly because of growing populations and growing economies are putting increased pressure on scarce water resources. And so the regions where we think these are a biggest problem are, for example, the Middle East, sub-Saharan Africa. But I would note that our database suggests that everywhere really is there, we see possible conflicts over water resources. And again, Susanne's initial question about climate change, I'm a hydrologist and a climate scientist in part by training. We know that climate change is real. We know that it's human caused. And we know that some of the most significant impacts are on water resources, on the timing of water availability, on the nature and severity of extreme events like droughts and floods, which contribute to triggering conflicts over water resources. And another factor here is, of course, the greatest concerns are in failed states where we have failed agreements, we have failed governance, we have lack of agreements. And so, again, those are the areas, as Aaron pointed out, where development assistance, where political intervention is really important. And I know that we'll come back to talk about strategies to reduce the risks of conflicts in a few moments. But we did a report with the World Resources Institute, we, the Pacific Institute, with the World Resources Institute, with the Water Security Partnership that Susanne is key, a member of, looking at technology that might apply to reducing the risks of conflicts over water, economic strategies, policies and institutions, and legal and political strategies.